Lecture 2, The Problem of Warfare's Origins.
We ended the last lecture by attempting to define what warfare is and saw two different approaches to defining the problem. In this lecture, we focus more closely on the issue of war's origins, but the problems of definition and origins are inherently linked. As a rule, anthropologists distinguish a hierarchy of social orders that runs from families to clans to tribes to chiefdoms and finally to states. Each has its own defining characteristics, but even a casual glance reveals the essential feature of the sequence. Each level includes more and more people. A clan embraces more people than a family, a tribe more than a clan, a chiefdom more than a tribe, and so on. If we favour the operational definition of warfare, the conclusion has to be that war, so defined, originated with the state or with immediately pre-state organisations, since the use of tactical formations requires a certain level of population density, specialisation and social organisation that is unlikely to be found below these levels. If so, warfare cannot have been a regular feature of human life much before the Neolithic era of 10 to 8,000 years ago. Remember, this definition of war does not rule out earlier forms of intra-species organised violence. It just refuses to consider such violence warfare. Alternatively, the social substitution definition of warfare allows us to consider many types of conflict not conducted with formations as war. Warfare defined in this way can be identified among very simple pre-agricultural peoples, certainly among tribes and possibly even clans if we include the vendetta. This would suggest a far earlier appearance of warfare, sometimes in the Paleolithic era, perhaps tens of thousands of years ago. Do note, however, that low population densities probably meant that conflicts were rare. In most cases, simple bands of hunter-gatherers having an unsegmented social order of clans or small tribes and with lots of open space around them could move easily away from potential threats rather than stand and fight it out. So while warfare may have existed in these very early years, it was probably rather infrequent. It might seem that either of these propositions could be tested against the prehistoric evidence, which, by definition, will be entirely archaeological. If, on the one hand, no convincing evidence for warfare can be found prior to state formation around 3000 BC, then the operational definition gains strength. But if, on the other, good archaeological evidence for prehistoric warfare can be found early on, then the social substitution definition looks the more convincing. The quest for evidence, however, proves to be very difficult, since there is no easy way to determine from physical remains alone how particular acts of violence were carried out, and modality is the core of the operational definition. Even more difficult is that one's definition of war guides the very identification of the types of evidence to be considered in the first place, so there is a risk of circularity in reasoning. That is, one can use a particular definition of war to identify pertinent evidence, and then use that same evidence to justify the definition. So in effect, the definition confirms itself. With these caveats in mind, let's survey the archaeological evidence.
We need good fighters.
Taken as a whole, archaeological evidence for prehistoric warfare falls into three classes, but each presents its own interpretive difficulties. The first class is human remains that display evidence of trauma. Very ancient bones are known featuring injuries, breaks, fractures, punctures, cut marks, and so forth. But it is usually unclear how this trauma was caused. Was an arm or a head broken in warfare, in an attack by a wild animal, or in a clumsy accident? There is often no way to tell. There is just the damaged bone, mute and inscrutable. In some cases, puncture wounds in skulls are clearly the result of human action, since the holes correspond in shape and size to known stone tools. But again, who did the killing and why? Was it a sacrifice? Maybe an execution? An isolated murder? Was the killer in formation? There's usually no way of telling. For warfare, the very minimal requirement would be violent death attested in groups, and such finds have indeed been made. A Mesolithic-era cave at Offnet in Germany from about 7,000 years ago yielded 37 skulls that had been deliberately severed from their owners' trunks, painted in ochre, and then carefully arranged in two circular nests. The skulls came from men, women, and children. and they bore clear evidence of massive violence in the form of axe holds and bludgeon injuries. To some scholars, this is hard evidence of Stone Age warfare, at least in Germany. That most of the skulls come from women and children suggests, again, to some scholars, a massacre during a raid. A parallel is found in the documented procedure among some so-called primitive peoples of taking trophy heads from fallen enemies. This explains the unusual configuration of this particular find at Ufnet, 2 circles of nested, severed heads. But matters are not so clear-cut on closer inspection. First, the skulls cannot be trophies since they were located at the back of a very large cave in a place so remote that they were left undisturbed until the discovery in 1908. Trophy heads, in comparison, are prominently displayed outside the victors' houses or on poles around the village. Second, we have no way of knowing whether the skulls were all collected and deposited after a single incident, or over a number of years, perhaps even over a series of decades. Clearly, the painting and arrangement of the heads attest ceremonial treatment, but the nature either of the killing or of the ceremony is forever lost to us. Contexts other than warfare are just as conceivable and no less plausible. Sacrifice, for instance. Interspecies killing, this most certainly is, but warfare, well, all we can say is perhaps. Even more dramatic and often cited as solid evidence for early warfare is the mass and unceremonious burial at Jebel Sahaba in the Sudan, dating to about 12,000 years ago. Here were found the remains of 59 individuals, men, women and children, ranging in age from infants to seniors. No grave goods were found in association with these burials, and about half of the people had suffered violent deaths, some of them quite horrific. One young adult girl, for instance, had no less than 21 stone artifacts embedded in her body, in her head, spine, arms, legs, ribs and pelvis. Others showed similar signs of multiple injuries. More so than Ufna, Jebel Sahaba has been taken as unambiguous evidence for a mass burial after a massacre, probably after a raid, given the presence especially of infants, toddlers, women and seniors, the population of a village with the menfolk off, perhaps fighting a war themselves. The multiple injuries suggest to some a procedure called pin cushioning, whereby members of a raiding party each take a share in the kill in order to deflect guilt away from any one individual. But yet again, the situation is not so clear-cut on closer inspection. Recall that only half of the burials show signs of violent death. That means half do not. The burials were carried out singly or in small groups of 4 to 8. This is not a one-time burial of 59 individuals thrown into a communal pit. Over how long a period did the burials take place? The absence of grave goods makes dating them relative to each other virtually impossible. And how were the injuries inflicted? Why were they inflicted? The simple answer to all of these questions is we don't know. The second class of archaeological evidence for early war is prehistoric weapons, principally axes, javelins, arrowheads, and so on. The problem here is that many such artifacts can also serve non-military, mundane functions. More instructive are tools with an exclusively military purpose. Examples of these include maces or daggers, neither of which are of much use in the hunt or for other purposes, but are very, very good for killing people. Some scholars insist, however, that maces or daggers have long served as status symbols for chiefs. While certainly true, this observation in no way detracts from their essentially military nature, and so it can be set aside as largely irrelevant. Maces and daggers, let alone swords, are all relatively late arrivals in the prehistoric toolbox, which might itself be an instructive observation. Finally, there are monuments and iconography that seem to attest the practice of early war. From the Neolithic period, we find impressive fortifications at Jericho in Israel, dating to about 7000 BC, or from the prehistoric ring forts in Western Europe, or the Pueblo-like defensive configuration of the houses at the village at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, dating to around 6500 BC. Some of these fortifications can be very impressive. The walls of Jericho ran for 700 yards and still stand over 20 feet tall. The circuit also had a single tower, 30 feet high, built up against the inside of the wall, with a set of 22 interior steps leading up to the top. Does the sophistication of these fortifications imply a corresponding sophistication on the part of the attackers they were supposedly designed to repel? Can we infer, perhaps, tactical formations from the fear that induced the Jerichoans to such efforts? But then again, Jericho is unique in the Neolithic Near East. It does not seem that other towns had walls like this. So might the walls be a product not of fear, but of display, to telegraph power and wealth? Might they not be a statement of organization, order, and communal effort? Even if they were defensive, can we be absolutely sure that they were warding off a human threat? If so, why didn't other settlements take the same precautions? Once more, uncertainty about context complicates interpretation. Iconography is another class of ancient monument. Some cave paintings from Spain are particularly instructive. One appears to show armed men holding their bows over their heads, led by a chief, marked by an elaborate headdress. The chief's headdress is bigger than the rest. But what are they doing? Now, one possibility is certainly that they're setting out on a war party, as some like to believe. But they could also be dancing, or they could be going on a hunt. Another depiction shows a fight between an army of 4, so-called, and an army of 3. 2 of the 4 are moving in from the sides in an apparent flanking movement. Is this evidence of formations and tactical planning, as some would like to argue? Or is it an ambush or a raid? Or perhaps we don't have a clue what we're looking at, since the artistic conventions of the Neolithic are unknown to us. The same is true of a painting of a so-called execution, in which a group of 10 men armed with bows seems to be celebrating the death of a fallen figure who has precisely 10 arrows sticking out of him or her. This is very clearly an act of pin cushioning, but we cannot tell under what circumstances it has taken place. It could be the execution of a malefactor, or the ambush of a targeted wrongdoer, or part of a wider raid. The problems of interpreting the archaeological record ought now to be clear. To an extent, these problems stem from the mute nature of archaeological evidence, which only gains meaning through interpretation. And here is where the danger of circular reasoning arises. Convinced that warfare is a very early phenomenon with particular characteristics, the eager scholar uses this conviction to identify mass burials or certain artifacts or images as significant, and then selectively interprets some features of these finds to validate the original conviction. In fact, an open interpretation of the finds leads to many plausible possibilities that really cannot be definitively resolved into a single right answer. This is the main problem with interpreting physical remains alone. We must look at them largely divorced from their original cultural context. This opens up the danger of our imposing a context on them, and that imposition will most likely reflect whatever theoretical model we prefer. We therefore risk using a model to validate itself. Now, the foregoing ought not to lead to despair in treating the prehistoric evidence. A fair assessment of it does suggest that, at the very least, intraspecies killing was not unknown to our ancestors. The difficulty lies in pinning down the character of that killing. In the face of such interpretive difficulties with the prehistoric evidence itself, one approach has been to use ethnographic accounts of contemporary so-called primitive peoples as a lens through which to view the archaeological evidence. Anthropology offers a treasure trove of data on the prosecution of conflict among numerous less complex societies, as we saw with the Yanomamo or the Maring in the last lecture. So perhaps the conventions of modern traditional societies can shed light on prehistoric behavior and help guide our interpretations. We have seen this already with suggestions about trophy heads or the process of pin cushioning, as applied to the prehistoric data. Both of these suggestions derive from ethnographic comparanda. Now, Turney High, for his part, simply assumed the applicability of ethnographic material to the past, and his analysis moves seamlessly between modern records of war among Plains Indians, Africans, or Papua New Guineans, and historical records of war among ancient Scythians, Gauls, or Germans. On this perspective, primitive war is essentially all of a kind, wherever and whenever it was practiced, so that modern-day so-called primitives provide direct analogues for our Stone Age ancestors. A more thoroughgoing application of this approach is found in Raymond Kelly's book, Warless Societies and the Origins of War. Kelly, as we saw in the previous lecture, first establishes what is truly distinctive about warfare, namely the calculus of social substitutability. He then charts this type of warfare among 2 neighbouring tribes on the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. Both warring societies had an unsegmented organization, but were very warlike due to their circumscribed habitat on the islands, and to their ethnic differences, and to intense competition over resources. The war was conducted in typical low-intensity, primitive fashion. Individuals were shot and killed on sight when spotted in the jungle, and raids and counter-raids were organized against opposing villages. From this initial definition, and then this ethnographic test case, Kelly then formulates a model for conditions generating early war. War will be rare among unsegmented societies in conditions of low population density. Warfare might erupt between unrelated groups over competition for resources, such as hunting rights in a patch of jungle, for instance, especially if the population density is high and the environment is circumscribed in such a way that rival groups cannot easily move away from each other, as on the Andaman Islands. When we add into this model the increasing complexity of human societies and the appearance of segmental social orders, warfare can be surmised to have evolved only gradually over the Paleolithic period between about 1 million and 10,000 years ago, probably starting out as capital punishment and revenge killing, and then becoming more collective as the calculus of social substitutability was invoked. In all instances, in Kelly's view, warfare is a socially constructed activity clearly demarcated from a state of peace by various rituals and ceremonies. Finally, Kelly then applies this model to the archaeological evidence and locates the emergence of warfare as a gradual process in the Upper Paleolithic era, that is between about 35,000 and 10,000 years ago. It only became, however, a regular and intense feature of human life in the subsequent Neolithic era. His whole procedure then is to construct a model of Stone Age conditions from modern ethnographic data and then use that model to interpret the archaeological evidence. Critics, however, maintain that modern ethnography throws little or no light on ancient conditions. An extreme version of this view consigns all ethnography to the dust heap by appealing to a sort of anthropological Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Physicist Werner Heisenberg, as you probably know, deduced that quantum physics was hampered by the fact that conditions necessary for observation affected the way particles behaved. We therefore cannot be sure that we are seeing the natural behavior of particles rather than some effect induced by the experimental protocol designed to observe them. The anthropological version of this principle argues that the social behavior is altered by the very presence of anthropologists, who usually live among the people they are describing for months or even years at a time. Few, however, hold this view to be true. In the case of warfare, we would have to accept that otherwise peaceful people suddenly became warlike to impress a professor in a pith helmet. A more cogent objection is that modern traditional cultures have not been frozen in time and bypassed by evolution. Rather, they too have evolved over the past 35,000 years, and they cannot be treated as living museum pieces from the Stone Age. Indeed, such an assumption is held to be deeply condescending to modern traditional societies. Influences from settled and so more warlike societies may have corrupted the purity of their supposedly prehistoric behavior. At least so goes the argument. Now, the response to such objections is to be clear about what is being compared: types of social organization, not precise patterns of behavior. If unsegmented societies tend to be warless, this will be true both for modern and for ancient unsegmented societies. There is no need to think of modern traditional communities as frozen in time or bypassed by evolution. It is the social logic underlying actions rather than the actions themselves that is instructive for the prehistorian interested in the origins of war. Such, in any case, is the sort of response offered by the ethnographically inclined. But the debate goes on, and it is far from resolved, and I'm not going to stick my head over the top of the trench and offer you an opinion. We end by considering an entirely different line of inquiry into the origins of war that looks at factors even deeper than our social conventions, our genetic code. The vast majority of known human societies, ancient and modern, simple or complex, practice some sort of identifiable warfare. On all continents and nearly every time period, evidence of intercommunity violence can be found. This is a fact that demands explanation, and some find the cultural contextual emphasis of anthropological models insufficient and unsatisfying as a response to it. Can circumstance and context alone explain so wide a shadow was that cast by warfare over human affairs? In fact, peaceful and non-warlike societies are the exception to the rule, whether they are ancient or modern. Even Kelly's study of warless societies makes this abundantly clear. Out of 563 documented human societies in the Atlas of World Cultures of 1981, only 7 can be classed as peaceful. And some of those are entirely artificial, such as the Hutterites, a religious community expressly set up in protest against prevailing norms. To some scholars, the near universality of warfare points to deep-seated roots, and culture-specific arguments begin to weaken in the face of the great diversity of communities practicing it. One approach has been to look at ethology, the study of animals. While ants or fish display intraspecies aggression, particular attention has been paid to our evolutionary relatives among the primates, especially the chimpanzee, with whom we share 98% of our genetic code. This approach deduces an evolutionary origin for patterns of male coalitional violence which stand at the root of human warfare. The classic study of chimp behavior was conducted by Jane Goodall for several decades beginning in the 1960s at the Gombe Reserve in Tanzania. Here it was found that chimps, usually males, hunt in coordinated groups for meat, preferably monkeys. Their domestic interactions were marred by routine violence as males batter and abuse females and fought among themselves over status in a hierarchy of dominance. Chimp bands at Gombe occupied particular territories, and groups of males went on border patrols. Even more remarkably, in the 1970s, it was found that such patrols, normally about 6 to 8 strong, would deliberately invade neighbouring territory, advancing stealthily through the unknown country, hunting. What they were hunting, however, was not monkeys, but fellow chimps, usually a lone member of the neighbouring band. If located, the alien chimp was attacked and brutally beaten, bitten, torn, battered, and left for dead. Disturbing evidence emerged of needless cruelty, such as the tearing off of testicles or fingernails. Often, researchers would find only the aftermath of such assaults, or notice injuries or disappearances among the observed chimp population. But on those rare occasions when the violence was actually observed directly, the attacking chimps became visibly excited during the assault and continued to be so afterwards. They would beat the trees, pull down branches and beat the ground, and they would go back home and they would be what my undergraduates would say, pumped. Eventually, at Gombe, the more aggressive band entirely wiped out their neighbours and occupied their territory. But this brought them into contact with a new band, previously one territory removed, which now began raiding into the victorious band's range. Chimp wars raged on. Now, it's hardly rocket science to see how such observations have an impact on our understanding of the origins of human warfare. If a shared chimp-human ancestor who lived sometime before 5 million years ago, when the chimpanzee and human lines diverged on the evolutionary tree, if that ancestor practiced the same sort of raiding observed in modern chimps and in some traditional human societies, then the roots of warfare extend deeper than the roots of our very species. Warfare, it seems, predates humanity itself. This approach is termed sociobiology, in that it seeks to explain social action through biological means. Needless to say, it has its critics, and they have some very cogent arguments in their arsenal. One will be obvious. How could we say that the behaviour of chimps observed for only 40 years, in the time when their habitat is under severe pressure from human development, is the same as that of a chimp-human ancestor who lived more than 5 million years ago in an unrestricted environment? Is that assumption rather not a large leap of faith? In fact, since we know that environment influences behaviour, is it not more likely that the violence observed in modern chimps is a recent development, a reaction to their being hunted by humans, to their forests being cut down and burned, and to their being squeezed into smaller and smaller ranges? A recent discovery in the Congo was particularly damaging to the sociobiological view. Here, in 1999, a group of chimps was encountered in a remote part of the jungle, some 37 miles from the nearest human settlement. These chimps had never seen a human before, since they showed no signs of fear. Instead, they were curious and gathered about to examine what to them were strange-looking apes. These naive chimps, as they're called, have so far shown no signs of violence, even between males within bands. If indeed they are peaceful chimps, then the violence observed at Gombe and elsewhere is a product not of genes, but of circumstance. While this may be so, I personally find it nevertheless very significant and interesting that both chimps and humans react in such similar ways to constraint, resource competition, and circumscription. The very factors that we've seen are thought by some to have generated warfare in the first place. It is clearly the case that we are not genetically doomed to coalitional violence in all circumstances, but rather that certain environmental conditions elicit intergroup violence both in humans and in chimps. Yet there are those who insist categorically that warfare is strictly a human business and a product of human culture, in which genes play a negligible part or no part at all. These scholars argue that the cultural aspects of human behavior are paramount and free us from the constraints of our biological proclivities. Examples of human urges constrained by culture are so numerous as to need no citation here. So even if we are inclined to aggression and war by our genes, it is our culture that shapes how these inclinations are manifested, if at all. In this sense, arguing from biology without culture entirely misses the point and risks dangerous oversimplification. To be sure, the addition of culture vastly complicates analogizing human and animal behavior. There is a risk of projecting onto animal actions and motives for actions ideas or motives that are properly belong only in the human sphere. We cannot know the mind of an ape. We can go further. If war and aggression are biologically hardwired into us, why do so many cultures recognize the inherent wrongness of killing by insisting on purificatory rituals for their warriors on returning from battle? Why do armies in more complex societies need to be trained to kill if aggression is our natural default setting? And most people are observably non-violent and go through their whole lives without ever intentionally hurting, never mind actually killing another person. Surely all this suggests that warfare is an aberration, a cultural construct foisted on an otherwise peaceful species. That's at least one line of argument. It is important to be clear on the evidence and the issues it generates, however. Emotions or politics ought not to shape scientific conclusions. In 1986, 20 prominent scientists issued the Seville Statement on Violence during UNESCO's International Year of Peace. The statement is a noble one and expressly condemns any suggestion that aggression and warfare have genetic roots. It states, in part, and I quote, "It is scientifically incorrect to say that we have inherited a tendency to make war from our animal ancestors. Warfare is a peculiarly human phenomenon and does not occur in other animals. We conclude that biology does not condemn humanity to war and that humanity can be freed from the bondage of biological pessimism." The obvious fear of the authors, and many of its supporters, is that widespread acceptance of a biological aspect in war-making will be used to exonerate any amount of awfulness as natural behaviour that cannot be curtailed. Noble attempts to curb warfare would be stymied by such beliefs. Given how biological arguments have been misused in the past, and the sordid history of eugenics springs to mind, this fear is not unwarranted. Yet in my personal opinion, despite its good intentions, the Seville Statement on Violence takes a step too far. It seeks, for emotional reasons, to shut down by fiat lines of inquiry that it feels may carry dubious consequences. But it is incumbent on researchers, like detectives, to follow wherever the leads take them. It is not enough to say such and such an avenue is lined with threatening implications. We must eschew it. Further, none of the sociobiologists seriously argue that we are doomed by our genes to a path of unrelenting butchery. Rather, they are fully cognizant of how complex the cultural aspects of human behavior are, war included. In the case of chimpanzees, for instance, the researchers are quite clear that human and chimp wars cannot be analogized in a facile manner. Human wars, even of the most simplistic type, are infinitely more complex than anything chimps do. Rather, they believe that the possibility of identifying species-specific patterns of behavior that contribute towards prevalence is significant, worthy of study, and may lead to a deeper understanding of the phenomenon. On a broad historical and anthropological perspective, it remains the case that warless and peaceful societies are the exception to the rule. This generality of warfare demands explanation, and the sociobiological arguments offer an interesting and potentially useful avenue of investigation for explaining it. Cultural determinism grows weaker and more ad hoc the greater the observed frequency of warfare in different places. If, however, coalitional male violence is an ingrained proclivity practiced over millions of years of our evolutionary history and elicited by certain environmental conditions, then the generality of the phenomenon has been accounted for. It is critical to be clear that coalitional male violence, as observed in chimps and people, is not a genetic destiny, but an inherited proclivity brought out by circumstance. I don't think it is naive or unethical to suggest that, just as triggering circumstances have been investigated intensely, so too ought the possibility of a genetic component in the phenomenon. The identification of an evolutionary element in the origin of warfare does not require us to accept a sentence for our species of life without the possibility of peace. As the anthropologists so cogently demonstrate, cultural choices do indeed free us from the bondage of our biology. We can mould our culture to negate our worst impulses. Given this, surely the fullest possible understanding of what we are up against best equips us for that task.